The man who shuffled into the Millbrook police station at 3:17 in the morning on February 14th, 2024, was wearing clothes that had not been manufactured since 2015, carrying a wallet containing currency that had been removed from circulation 3 years earlier, and insisting with absolute conviction that he had been held captive in a basement for 9 years by people whose faces he could not remember, in a house he could not locate, in a town whose name he had never learned. But when Detective Angela Reyes ran his identification through every database available to law enforcement, she discovered something that would keep her awake for the rest of her increasingly short life. The man existed in no missing persons registry anywhere in the country, and when she called the emergency contacts listed in his wallet, every single one of them claimed they had never heard his name before. His name was Thomas Brennan, according to the driver's license that showed a face matching the gaunt figure seated in the interview room, though the photograph depicted a man 40 pounds heavier, with color in his cheeks and light in his eyes that had long since been extinguished. The license had expired in 2017 and listed an address in Columbus, Ohio, a city 300 miles from the small Pennsylvania station, where Thomas had appeared like a ghost materializing from morning fog. Detective Reyes called the Columbus Police Department and asked them to check the address, expecting to find a family desperate for news about their missing loved one. What they found instead was a house that had been demolished in 2016 to make way for a parking structure, with no records of any Brennan ever having lived there. Thomas sat perfectly still throughout the initial interview, his hands folded on the table in a posture that suggested years of practice, remaining motionless in spaces where movement attracted unwanted attention. He spoke in a voice that cracked from disuse, words emerging slowly as if he was remembering how language worked after a long period of silence. He said he had been taken from a grocery store parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2015, pulled into a van by hands that gripped with inhuman strength, injected with something that turned the world to black cotton, that pressed against his consciousness for what felt like years. He woke in a basement that had no windows and one door that never opened from his side. The details of his captivity were simultaneously too specific to be fabricated and too strange to be believed. He described a room approximately 12 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls that wept moisture constantly regardless of temperature. He was fed through a slot in the door, meals appearing at irregular intervals that made tracking time impossible. He never saw his captors directly, only heard footsteps above him and voices speaking in a language he could not identify, conversations that sometimes continued for hours with cadences that suggested argument or ritual, or perhaps both. He knew he was not alone in that basement because he could hear others breathing in the darkness, other captives whose voices he never heard because speaking was punished in ways he refused to describe. Detective Reyes had investigated missing persons cases for 17 years, and she had developed an instinct for distinguishing genuine trauma from performance. Thomas Brennan was not performing. The tremor in his hands when he described the darkness was involuntary. The way his eyes tracked shadows in the corners of the interview room was the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that threats could emerge from anywhere without warning. The scars on his wrists and ankles, visible when his sleeves and pants shifted, were consistent with prolonged restraint. Whatever had happened to this man, whatever truth lay beneath his impossible claims, the suffering was authentic even if the circumstances were not. The investigation began with standard procedures that produced increasingly non-standard results. Thomas provided his Social Security number, which the database identified as belonging to a Thomas Brennan who had died in 1987 at the age of 3 from complications of pneumonia. He provided his mother's maiden name, which matched no family in the state of Ohio or any surrounding region. He provided the name of the high school he had attended, which had closed in 2003, and whose records had been destroyed in a fire that the archivist described as suspicious but never solved. Every thread Detective Reyes pulled unraveled into nothing, as if Thomas Brennan's entire existence prior to his captivity had been carefully erased or had never existed in the first place. The photographs on his phone, which had been in his pocket when he was taken and which his captors had apparently never removed, told a story that contradicted reality in ways that made Reyes's head hurt to contemplate. The images showed Thomas at birthday parties with friends whose faces appeared in no facial recognition database. They showed him at a workplace whose address corresponded to an empty lot that city records indicated had been vacant since 1994. They showed him with a woman he identified as his girlfriend Sarah Chun, whose name appeared nowhere in any government record, despite Thomas insisting they had dated for 3 years and had been discussing marriage when he disappeared. Sarah Chun became the focus of intensive investigation, with Reyes dedicating resources she could not officially justify to finding a woman who should have been easy to locate in an era of total digital connectivity. The phone number Thomas provided had never been assigned to any customer. The email address returned no results from any provider. The apartment where Sarah had lived, according to Thomas's detailed memories, was occupied by an elderly man who had resided there for 47 years without interruption. When Reyes showed Thomas a photograph of the building's interior, he stared at it with an expression of confused recognition, pointing out furniture that the current occupant confirmed had been present when he moved in decades ago, furniture that should have been impossible for Thomas to identify if he had never been inside. Thomas agreed to a psychiatric evaluation which produced findings that the examining doctor described as unprecedented in his 30-year career. Thomas showed no signs of delusional disorder, no evidence of psychosis, no indicators of the conditions that typically produced false memories of elaborate captivity scenarios. His account remained consistent across multiple tellings, with the kind of minor variations that indicated genuine memory rather than rehearsed fabrication. The doctor concluded that Thomas either possessed the most sophisticated false memory syndrome ever documented, or he was telling the truth about experiences that could not be reconciled with observable reality. Neither explanation was satisfying. Neither explanation was safe. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came when a technician examining Thomas's phone discovered metadata in the photographs that should not have existed. The images were dated correctly according to Thomas's timeline, showing capture dates between 2012 and 2015, but the phone model had not been released until 2018, meaning the photographs had been taken on a device that did not exist during the time period they documented. When confronted with this impossibility, Thomas showed no surprise, only a resignation that suggested he had begun to understand that his reality and the reality surrounding him had diverged in ways that could not be bridged through evidence or explanation. He asked Detective Reyes a question that she would think about every night until her death, a question that contained implications she was not prepared to process. He asked her if it was possible that he had been removed not just from a place but from existence itself. If his captors had not merely imprisoned his body, but had somehow extracted him from the fabric of the world, cutting him out of lives and records and memories so completely that even the people who had loved him no longer retained any trace of his presence. Reyes did not have an answer, but she noticed something that raised a hair on the back of her neck and would not settle down again. Every photograph in the station that included her own image had changed since Thomas Brennan arrived. The differences were subtle, positioning shifts and expression variations that she might not have noticed if she had not been studying evidence photographs all morning. But she was certain, with a certainty that felt like ice water in her veins, that she had been wearing a different shirt in her academy graduation photo. She was certain that she had been standing on the opposite side of the group in the department's annual picture. She was certain that reality was adjusting around Thomas Brennan's presence, making room for someone who should not exist by changing things that had already been. Thomas noticed her staring at the photographs and nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. He told her that it happened wherever he went now, that the world could not quite accommodate his return and was reshaping itself in small ways to compensate. He had seen it in the faces of people he passed on the street, recognition flickering briefly before being replaced by the blank expression of someone looking at a stranger. He believed his captors had released him deliberately, not out of mercy, but as an experiment to observe what happened when someone who had been removed from reality attempted to reintegrate. He believed he was still being watched, still being studied, still serving a purpose he could not understand. The other detectives in the station began avoiding Thomas with increasing obviousness as the days passed, their discomfort manifesting as canceled interviews and redirected resources. They claimed workload issues and jurisdictional complications, but Reyes saw fear in their eyes when they looked at the man sitting patiently in the interview room, waiting for someone to tell him where he belonged. The officer who had been assigned to supervise him requested reassignment after reporting that Thomas had spoken in his sleep in a language that sounded like English played backward, reciting phrases that the officer claimed to understand, despite never having studied any foreign language. The officer refused to reveal what the phrases meant, submitting his resignation letter the following morning. Thomas's physical condition deteriorated rapidly over the following week, though medical examinations could find no specific cause for his decline. He lost weight despite eating regular meals. His skin developed a grayish pallor that did not respond to any treatment. His eyes, which had been brown when he arrived, gradually lightened to a shade that the attending physician described as impossible, a color that existed outside the normal spectrum of human iris pigmentation. He seemed to be fading, becoming less substantial with each passing day, as if his reconnection to reality was failing, and he was being pulled back toward whatever void had contained him for 9 years. The missing persons report that Reyes had been expecting finally materialized on the 8th day, though it arrived in a form that provided no relief and considerable additional horror. A woman named Sarah Chun called the station claiming to have seen a news report about Thomas Brennan, a man she identified as her boyfriend who had vanished from a grocery store parking lot in 2015. She described Thomas perfectly, provided details about his life that matched his own account, and expressed tearful gratitude that he had finally been found. But when Reyes asked for her contact information to arrange a reunion, the line went dead. The phone number traced to a payphone in a town that had been evacuated after a chemical spill in 2008, a payphone that the telephone company had no record of maintaining. Sarah Chung appeared in person the following morning, walking into the station with the same impossible presence that Thomas had manifested upon his arrival. She matched the photographs on Thomas's phone exactly. A woman in her early 30s with features that surveillance footage could not quite capture correctly, always slightly out of focus no matter how often the technicians adjusted the equipment. She asked to see Thomas with an urgency that felt wrong to Reyes, a desperation that contained something other than love, something that resembled hunger more than relief. Reyes refused the request and discovered that the refusal had already been overridden, the reunion already occurring in an interview room whose door she had not seen open. The recording of what happened in that room exists only in fragments, the equipment having failed in ways that the technicians attributed to interference they could not identify. The audio captures Thomas's voice, initially expressing the joy of reunion, gradually shifting to confusion, then fear, then something beyond fear that the human vocal range should not have been able to express. Sarah's voice remains calm throughout, speaking in English that subtly wrongness emerged in as the conversation progressed, word orders shifting and meanings inverting, until the language she spoke could no longer be parsed by listeners who heard the recording. The video shows figures moving in the room, but their forms refuse to resolve into shapes that cameras were designed to capture, shadows that contain volume and mass and intent. When the recording ends, the room is empty. Thomas Brennan and Sarah Chun have vanished without opening the door or window, their presence extracted from the physical space as completely as Thomas's existence had been extracted from the world 9 years earlier. Detective Reyes searched the room herself and found only a single item remaining on the table where they had sat. It was a photograph that had not existed before, showing Thomas and Sarah together at what appeared to be their wedding, surrounded by guests whose faces were blank spaces where features should have been. The date printed on the photograph was 17 years in the future. The case file on Thomas Brennan was sealed by order of authorities whose names Detective Reyes had never encountered in her career, agencies whose existence she could not verify through any official channel. She was instructed to forget everything she had witnessed, to destroy her personal notes, to never speak of the man who had walked into her station claiming 9 years of captivity that no one remembered. She agreed to these conditions because the people giving orders carried an authority that transcended normal jurisdictional boundaries, because she understood without being told that resistance would result in consequences she did not want to contemplate. But forgetting proved impossible, particularly when she began noticing changes in her own life that followed the pattern Thomas had described. Photographs of her childhood now included moments she did not remember experiencing. Colleagues referred to cases she had never worked. Her sister called to discuss a vacation they had supposedly taken together to a location Reyes had never visited. Reality was adjusting around her, making room for something that was slowly replacing the person she had been, and she understood with dawning horror that her contact with Thomas had infected her with whatever condition he had carried. The detective who replaced Angela Reyes after her disappearance found her case notes hidden in a location the sealed orders had not covered, a personal storage unit whose existence appeared in no official records. He read the notes with growing disbelief, cross-referencing claims against databases that returned increasingly impossible results. He found himself drawn to the investigation despite warnings from superiors he did not recognize, compelled to understand what had happened to his predecessor and to the man she had tried to help. He began seeing discrepancies in his own photographs, hearing colleagues reference memories he did not share. He understood that he was following a path that led somewhere outside the boundaries of the world he knew. The cycle continues in Millbrook as it continues in towns across the country, where people occasionally appear claiming absences that no one else recalls. They walk into police stations and hospitals and government offices, carrying identification that should not exist and telling stories that cannot be verified. Some of them fade away before anyone can document their presence. Others are collected by people whose authority cannot be questioned, vanishing into vehicles that appear on no traffic cameras and leave no trace of their passage. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone who encountered them begins to change, their own existence becoming unstable, their own memories diverging from the records that should confirm them. Thomas Brennan was not a victim. He was not a survivor. He was something else entirely, a piece of a reality that runs parallel to our own, occasionally intersecting in moments that leave both worlds changed. The basement, he remembered, was real, but it was not located in any geography that maps could chart. The 9 years he experienced passed differently where he was held, if they passed at all, and the captors he never saw are still out there, still conducting experiments whose purpose human minds were not designed to comprehend, still removing people from the fabric of existence and occasionally returning them to observe the results. If you have ever felt that a memory did not match reality, that a photograph showed something different than you recalled, that people referenced events you could not remember experiencing, consider the possibility that you are not experiencing confusion or aging or minor mental glitches. Consider the possibility that reality has been adjusted around you, that someone has been removed from your life so completely that even your memories of them have been overwritten. Consider the possibility that somewhere in a place that exists between moments, someone who loved you is waiting to return to a world that has forgotten they ever existed. The door is always open for those who know how to look, and something is always watching to see who notices.